How good of an investor would Karl Popper have been? Karl Popper as a symbol here. I don't want to talk about the person necessarily. I don't know his personal finances or anything like that, nor do I know his biography. I want to talk about Karl Popper as a symbol for a process, as an operational technology for, in particular, epistemology in how we actually do things, in how we think about doing things. So those sort of questions. That's what I mean with Karl Popper. And I think it applies to, in particular, to investing, because Popper is often used as a sort of symbol for science. Okay, this is how science works. But Popper is really about how we think about thinking in general. It's not just about science. It's about anything that requires thinking, anything that requires agency, that requires people taking actions, or if you want, some sort of free will to make decisions, to go left versus right, to buy or sell. All these things are the same if you put it at this meta level that I want to talk about right now. And this is the gist of this episode. It is how good of an investor would Karl Popper have been in terms of how good of an investment process would Popperism offer? And the answer, I can already prelude this, is it is probably, if not the only way to generate wealth, it's certainly the best way to generate wealth that we could think of right now. And it has to do with what we call the innovation stack at Orange Capital Partners. This is the Not Even Wrong podcast. It's September 8, 2021. This is Krim Delco. Since the last update, we are down 80 basis points. The market is down 0.5%. For the year, we are up 14.5%. The market is up 20.2%. We're underperforming by 5.7%. So Karl Popper has a name for himself, in particular in the field of epistemology, which is the science of how things are done in terms of science. But again, I want to broaden this to not just science, to anything where knowledge, where intellectual capacity, where thinking, where things like that play a role. And I think, therefore, investing is, I would say, certainly, investing is definitely part of that equation. So that's why I think this is not just some sort of prank or whatever. This is actually a very serious episode, because I really want to think about the process of investing from a Popperian point of view and ask myself, how would it be? And I think it is not just a good way to invest. I think it's the only way to successfully navigate financial markets, and I'm going to elaborate what I mean. But let's get back to what is actually Karl Popper. What does Popperism stand for? What does it mean in a nutshell? And I think I can refer to Brad Hall's podcast about Popper, about David Deutsch, who is a sort of a modern application of Popperism, and how Deutsch, I think in very eloquent ways, explains what exactly Popperism is and why it's so important. This is another important part of this equation, is it's not just sort of a scientific approach and one of many or any of that stuff. It is very, very important, because it is the approach that I think fits best in our times, fits best into the framework of wealth generation and disruption. This is why this is so important. So if you're in the business of, I don't know, if you're Stalin or somebody like that, and you want to control everything and be a dictator or any of that stuff, if you're the Taliban, if you're something like that, then Popperism is not going to help you much in your approach towards life, because you need to have a different philosophy. If you are a God-fearing Southerner in the United States, I think Popperism will not help you much either, because, again, you are going to be exposed to ideas that don't really fit into your world philosophy. However, if you are living in Silicon Valley as a libertarian, wealth generator that believes in the application of fundamentally new concepts and engineering practices, that believes in changing the world with those, that believes in actually doing better things, at least from a product and services standpoint, and lowering the cost of living for people, and giving people more choice, and expanding freedom for people, then I think Popperism is the right philosophy. What is Popperism? In a nutshell, Popperism is applied to science. It is the process of solving problems. And while you're solving problems, you're creating new problems, and then you're helping solve them as well. And David Deutsch says that in one of his books, that the key here is that while you're solving problems and you're creating new problems, you are actually creating better problems. In other words, the word problem here might have a sort of a negative connotation. And what I mean is, it's not something like anxiety or you need to go to a therapist because you have a problem. It's not that sort of problem. It is the problem that simply when, let's say, you have a framework or a theory that applies to something, and then you have some sort of evidence that doesn't match the theory, or you have a theory that doesn't match the evidence, that kind of problem. And then you start working towards new solutions to the problem. This is what science, in a nutshell, means from a Popperian point of view. And now I want to arch into the business of investing. The purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense of what it feels like to run a hedge fund. So I want to talk about the application of Popperism now, in particular in investing. And there's two things that stand out here. First and foremost, I think investing, like science, is the process of problem solving. You're solving problems and you're trying to find solutions to problems. But what I'm trying to say here fundamentally is actually that the investment process itself is only a derivative of the actual action, if you want, or the actual relevant thing that's going on, and that is the entrepreneur. So the investment process is nothing but a reflection of the entrepreneur. Wealth generation from an investment perspective is nothing but the reflection of wealth generation from an entrepreneurial perspective. So therefore, we can say that Popperian approach to investing applies to the Popperian approach of entrepreneurship. And entrepreneurship fits very well into the realm of Popperian approaches to life, which is you look at the world, you have problems. Let's say you want to build an electric car based on lithium-ion batteries, and you have a problem of how to actually do that, and then you solve that problem. While solving that problem, you're going to create new problems. For example, how can you increase the power density or the range? How can you make that car more software driven? How can you make the battery software defined, etc.? You're creating new, better problems. And while you're doing that, you're creating a better and better product. You're offering more and more services. You're also lowering the price. You're increasing the value. And that is what we call at Orange Capital Partners the innovation stack, based on the book The Innovation Stack by Jim McKelvey. So there is a very nice connection here between Popperian approach, the Popperian approach of science, to the Popperian approach to entrepreneurship and wealth generation. We see this all in one realm. This is one big thing. It's just, it has different names. Again, Popperian approaches are not just limited to science. They are also very relevant when it comes to entrepreneurship. And entrepreneurship, from our point of view, is exactly what wealth generation is about. In other words, we investors, we can only generate wealth by investing in entrepreneurs that generate wealth. We, as investors, don't generate the wealth. And therefore, actually, our mission statement is, in that sense, almost misguiding. We are not the ones who generate the wealth. We are the ones who invest in companies that do generate wealth. So we channel resources, our own and our clients' resources, into assets, into processes, into Popperian processes. This is what we do in terms of generating wealth, because that's what we believe in. We believe that this is the way to generate wealth. There are other beliefs. Again, there are other belief systems. For example, Masayoshi Son at SoftBank, I would say, has a belief system which is more the one of, let's say, Stalin or dictators like that, which is you just dominate the market. You either kill everybody, of course not actually kill, but in terms of competitively, and then you dominate the market, you raise prices, and you are the number one player, and that's it. So that's a different approach towards generating wealth. And we at Orange Capital Partners are not fond of that. That's why we're not investing in companies like Uber or DoorDash and any of those companies. However, we believe that wealth can be generated also in this innovation stack way, which is you solve problems, you create new problems, you solve those problems, and you grow and grow and grow and become a monopoly of one, a unique you, which is unique by definition because the innovation stack that you've built is your own innovation. Nobody else can copy that. And this is what Jim McKelvey beautifully describes in his book when he talks about the threat of Amazon at Square and why Amazon wasn't able to compete with Square. Well, because they did not build that innovation stack which was necessary to compete with Square. So in that sense, again, I really want to bring this point home. The Popperian process in science equates exactly to the Popperian process in entrepreneurship, and that is what wealth creation is. Now, there's two more questions I want to ask in this particular episode, which are on top of my mind. Number one, Popper also says that it is impossible to predict the creation of knowledge, or we, at least at this point, don't have a technology, a science, or a theory of how knowledge is actually created. So in that sense, you could say investing is a futile process, because if you can't predict the creation of knowledge, how can you predict wealth generation? This is a valid question. I'm not going to question the lack of ability to predict knowledge. I don't think we have the ability to predict knowledge in a sense that, in a Popperian sense again, which is, for example, if we want to use Bayesian methods to, let's say, make a statement, oh, we're going to fly to Mars in 20 years. Based on the knowledge today, the probability that we're going to fly to Mars is 50% in 20 years, something like that. This is a futile statement because we don't know what kind of knowledge we will create in the next 20 years, and therefore it's completely useless to make that statement. This also goes back to the conversation of inductionism, which we are obviously opposed. Inductionism, or Elon Musk calls it reasoning by analogy. All those things are something we're trying. Of course, we're biased as human beings. We sometimes fall into traps. We still do that, but fundamentally, we don't want to be slaves of inductionism. We don't want to be falling into the fallacy of making predictions based on a knowledge that is available today, knowing that we will create new knowledge. For example, we don't know what kind of knowledge SpaceX will create in the next 5 years, so it's futile to speculate about the ability of SpaceX to fly to Mars. We don't know what kind of technology Tesla will create in the next 5 years, so we have no idea whatsoever of what kind of full self-drive technology Tesla will be able to offer in the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, just this is a side note here. Just imagine where we stand today with full self-drive. And full self-drive is kind of following, I would say, not a linear function, but it's a process that is predictable in a sense that we know what they're doing. They're issuing the next version, and Karpati and all these people are talking about what they're doing. But what if Tesla applies self-learning technology a la AlphaGo Zero? And what if Tesla starts doing, let's say, more work in the realm of deep learning applied to video animation, uses video animation for self-learning, and then breaks through and creates a car that, like AlphaGo Zero in the game of Go, also becomes just orders of magnitude more superior when it comes to self-driving. And then, you know, we're sitting here and we'll be like, oh my gosh, we didn't see that coming. These are the kinds of things that we believe can happen. We can't predict them, and therefore we shouldn't make statements such as, oh, there's a probability that we will have a self-driving car in the next 5 years is 50%. It is futile to make such predictions. So now let's get back to the question 2 then. Okay, so again, question 1 is, what do we do, or can we predict knowledge? The answer is no, we cannot predict knowledge. Now, what is question 2 is, well, what is it then we do as investors? If we can't predict knowledge, what the hell can we predict, or how can we allocate capital, sizable capital, to companies or entrepreneurs if we cannot predict who is going to come up with what knowledge? There's 2 approaches to that. One is what's being used in almost every large investment fund, also in Silicon Valley in the venture capital scene, and that is, excuse my French, throwing shit at the wall, hoping something sticks. In other words, diversification. Just buy enough, and then hope that somebody comes up with something. So what venture capital, traditional venture capital in Silicon Valley is doing is they say, look, there are certain things that we believe in, for example, crypto technology, CRISPR, full self-drive technology, AI, deep learning. These things are happening. It's not even a question. Now, we don't know who is going to come up with what knowledge. So what we're going to do is we're going to bet on certain personalities, and then we're just going to spread it. This is one way to do it. And in my view, it's not a very good way, because simply that's what everybody else is doing, and the returns of this approach, by definition, are very small. The other way to do this, and this is what we're doing at Orange Capital Partners, is to follow the creation of an innovation stack. Now, what does that mean? Now we're closing the circle here. Popper said that science in the Popperian way is done by building an innovation stack, create problems, solve problems, create problems, solve problems. We believe in the exact same process when it comes to wealth generation or entrepreneurship. So what we're looking at here is basically, okay, who is better at building an innovation stack to solve a particular problem? We have very large visions. For example, decarbonizing energy, or digitizing life science, making life science an engineering practice. Those are big visions. And we're looking at companies, technologies, entrepreneurs that are building an innovation stack that we believe has the chance to at least go in that direction. And then we're in sort of the realm of a famous quote by Vinod Khosla, which is, if I have to do an ROI, I'm not interested, because I want to be, if I'm right, then the returns are so large that it's kind of irrelevant what you know, how much I pay and all that stuff. What I'm trying to say here is that the point is, if we can invest in companies that are building an innovation stack around digitizing life science, around making cancer research less bespoke and more software driven, like the software industry, then we will generate so much wealth that things like, for example, which price we pay for, or that kind of stuff, is going to be irrelevant. Now, this is an incredibly difficult thing to do. It is incredibly difficult to look at an innovation stack and say, this is the right innovation stack. Is Tesla the right way to build an innovation stack? Or maybe somebody else should be doing it, maybe Cruise or GM or whatever. So this is incredibly difficult to answer. And this is why our business is an art form and it's not a, I can't, there's no book that explains this is how you do it. It is an art form in a sense that, or in a Popperian, where we haven't actually solved the problem of building an innovation stack effectively. So we're still in this try and error process. But there's a couple of things that we at Orange Capital Partners have identified in the last couple of years that I think are very useful, and I want to share that here. Number one, we define disruption as lowering the cost of iteration. If we can find businesses that are building innovation stacks that have also an ability, or in fact the innovation stack itself has to be built on top of an iteration platform where the costs of iteration are lowered. Ideally, through every iterations, the costs are getting lower and lower. This is one of the things we're so excited about with CRISPR. For example, Caribou Bioscience is a company which has come up with a new way of editing the genome, so it is much cheaper and you can do a lot more at scale. In fact, you can do something a little bit like the SIMD process in computer science, where you can do a lot of parallel genome editing and therefore iterate much faster over a much bigger universe of genes to find potential targets for pharma or find ways to solve cancer and all that. So if we have companies, again, let's get back to the concept of iteration. Iteration is at the core of building an innovation stack. Iteration is at the core of building a Popperian way, iteration is at the core of Popperianism. I'm not sure if Popper has actually said this in his own words, but I'm sure if he was standing next to me, he would be nodding right now. Yes. Popperism all depends on iteration. You cannot solve problems and create new problems and solve them without iteration. Iteration is key. The faster you can iterate, the lower the cost of iteration, the faster you can disrupt industries. This brings me to another point which we identified at Orange Capital Partners, which is if we can put iteration into a computing framework and then use Moore's law on our side, we have another huge booster. Why is computing? In fact, in certain areas, we believe, or at some point, the word iteration and compute will merge to become one word. And it could be called computation. Maybe that's what it's going to be. Whatever it is, why is computation and iteration at some point the same thing? Well, let's look at the self-driving approach that we believe Tesla should be at least thinking about, if not already applying, which is the AlphaGo Zero approach. What is AlphaGo Zero really doing? AlphaGo Zero is using self-supervised reinforcement learning to find better strategies to play the game of Go. Now, if you play the game of Go, you have plenty of potential states. I think 10 to the 120 potential states that can be applied in the game of Go. And you have all these potential moves and strategies and all that. And the point here is that why did David Silver make that statement on the Lex Friedman podcast that with more computation, he predicts that the same model with just more computation will beat the older model, just because the same model with more computation can do more iterations and therefore can maybe find even more creative solutions to the game of Go. This is the fundamental key insight, I think, that I got from this, let's say, this particular interview between David Silver and Lex Friedman, but I think I can apply to the concept of self-supervised reinforcement learning and also in general to the process of Popperianism, which is if you can iterate faster through computation and therefore you have Moore's law on your side, you have a much better chance to disrupt industries, you have a much better chance to succeed in building an innovation stack that solves very big problems. So to summarize, would Karl Popper have been a good investor? The answer is absolutely so. Absolutely so. In fact, we believe that at least in this day and age, where we stand today, in terms of knowledge, in terms of wealth generation, Popperianism is the answer. The only other answer would be some sort of diversified approach, but then we believe the returns are too low, and I think Peter Thiel has spoken about this. It is, if you invest in too many startups, then in the end you're not going to succeed and all that. I don't want to go there right now. All I'm trying to say here is the following. If you have an approach that follows the Popperian point of view of the world, and that is you solve problems, create problems, solve problems. If you are completely detached from authority, completely detached from some predestined, this is how things are done, then you will succeed. You have a chance to succeed, or your probability of success is much higher. We are absolutely against inductionism. We are absolutely against Bayesianism. And we believe that Popperianism is actually applied not just to science, but also to entrepreneurship and wealth generation, and therefore has the same power like it has in science. And we at Orange Capital Partners unintentionally, actually, interestingly enough, unintentionally have been following the Popperian approach. And now with this episode, we're formulating it explicitly that wealth generation follows a Popperian point of view, a Popperian process, which is the build out of an innovation stack driven by fast, lower cost of iteration, which is, in other words, that's what we call disruption. And the faster you can lower the cost of iteration and the faster you can bring in computation into the process, the higher the probability of success. Thank you.